So this is the fifth film in the Rethinking Existentialism series. And in this film, I'm going to talk about the relation between existentialism and psychoanalysis. Because this is, I think, usually misrepresented. It's usually set up as a kind of opposition. So the idea is usually presented that existentialism is a rejection of psychoanalysis, or at least of the classical Freudian kind of psychoanalysis. Um, and I think there are very good reasons why it's usually set up that way. And Sartre and Beauvoir certainly reject Freud's theory of the mind, of the structure of the mind, and as a result, they reject his theory of the origins of motivation, and so the origins of behavior. But despite those disagreements, Beauvoir and Sartre both find a lot of valuable insight in Freud's work, and they both want to preserve that kind of insight, or those insights, and they want to preserve the Freudian idea of psychoanalysis more broadly, whilst rejecting his theory of mind. So I think it's a shame to focus on that disagreement to the exclusion of the agreement. And I think once you see the disagreement in the context of the broader agreement, it comes to seem less important, the disagreement. Rather than looking like they disagree with Freud on something so fundamental they must just reject everything Freud says, it rather looks like they agree with Freud on much of his understanding at a kind of surface level of what's going on in the mind and what's going on when people have problems that they seek the help of psychoanalysis to solve. But they disagree with the theoretical structures that Freud postulated in order to explain his clinical findings. And they want to postulate a different set of theoretical structures which they think provide a better explanation of those findings. So in this sense, I want to say that, look, existentialism actually stands in the Freudian tradition. Right? When Sartre and Beauvoir both talk about their own form of existentialist psychoanalysis, they don't mean that as a rejection of Freud. They mean to be contributing to the Freudian psychoanalytic tradition, setting out a particular variety of it, and one that they think is ultimately that builds on, but is better than Freud's original form. So what is it that they reject about Freud? They reject what's become known, and I don't really understand why, but it's become known as Freud's meta-psychology. Basically his theory of mind, his philosophy of mind, his theory of the structures of of motivation. Okay, and this is the famous theory of the conscious and the unconscious. At least that's how Freud starts describing this division in the mind that he wants to describe. As his work progresses through his life, he brings in a variety of other terminologies and distinctions, and he talks particularly about the ego and the id and the superego in a book in 1931, I think. But throughout those changes in terminology, there's a basic underlying structure that remains the same, even though he wants to describe it from different perspectives and in different ways, and sometimes revise some of the details of what he says about it. And the basic underlying structure is still, I think, a kind of dualism, right? He wants to divide the mind between those functions of the mind, or those items in the mind which are subject to rationality, which he calls being subject to the reality principle on the one hand, and on the other hand, the items and functions and processes in the mind which are basically irrational and subject to what he calls the pleasure principle. So what is this distinction? Well, so the rational processes and items, as I see it, are they're subject to the reality principle, partly because they are sensitive to the way the world in fact is. So think about beliefs, the beliefs you have about the world, about where you live, or what the weather is like at the moment, or your social surroundings, or any of those beliefs. Those are at least attempting to track reality. They're attempting to, there are features of your mind that are attempting to inform you about the way things in fact are. Okay, so that's one feature of the rational structure of the mind. But another feature is that those aspects of your mind are sensitive to one another. They're rationally sensitive to one another. They're governed by principles of inference and non-contradiction in particular. So if you have two contradictory beliefs, which I'm sure we all have contradictory beliefs, but it's when you come to notice that two things that you think can't both be true at the same time, that seems to you a reason to work out which one's wrong. Right? One of them must be wrong, and you try to work that out. And that's because they're parts of your mind that are governed by the reality principle. If they can't both be true, they're not both correctly tracking reality. So the contradiction has to be resolved. Similarly, you can infer something, you can draw a conclusion from other things that you believe, and thereby seem to expand your knowledge of reality on the basis of the knowledge that you already had. Okay, so those are kind of rational processes of inference and of tracking the way things are. And then there's the irrational things, which Freud's paradigm examples are drives, which are kind of basic desires. And these are governed by the pleasure principle. Pleasure is just the satisfaction of a desire, I think, in Freud's understanding of it. So all that means is that your desires or drives are items that features of your mind that want to be satisfied. Okay, and then you have lots of these. So for example, hunger, right, or thirst. If you're thirsty, that's a drive to drink some water, or satisfy the desire for a drink. If you're hungry, that's a drive to get some food. And its aim is not to tell you anything about the world. Its aim is not to be coherent with your other beliefs about the world or anything of the sort. Its aim is to get you to eat some food, which will satisfy, or drink some water, which will satisfy the drive. And then you have lots of other. I mean, those are kind of basic drives, and the sex drive is another basic drive for Freud. But also drives then combine into complexes of drives. So you get quite complicated sets of desires. But these, as I say, are not governed by rational rules of inference or non-contradiction. They're not governed by trying to represent the way the world really is, or the way anything really is. And they are essentially governed by trying to express themselves and become satisfied in action. And it's that dualism that underlies his difference between the unconscious and the conscious, right? It's not simply that the irrational ones are the unconscious ones, right? Because some of your drives are perfectly conscious. You know that you're hungry when you're hungry. You know that you're thirsty when you're thirsty, right? There's nothing mysterious about that. The mystery comes into the mind for Freud in that some of your drives, and particularly some complexes of drives, like the Oedipus complex, are desires for things which are socially disapproved of and which are forbidden. And as a result, you not only refuse to act on those drives, you also refuse to acknowledge those drives. You refuse to believe you even have those desires, and so you repress them. And that's the basic Freudian idea of repression. And then that repression can cause trouble for you as those drives try to express themselves and try to become satisfied in your behaviour, even despite your repression of them. So the dynamically unconscious, the repressed drives are the problematic ones that need to be uncovered and understood in psychoanalysis, whereas other drives are perfectly conscious, and all the rational rationally structured features of your mind that obey the reality principle are all consciously accessible, and they have to be consciously accessible, right? Because one of the principles that governs their structure is that they're available for inference, that you can draw inferences on the basis of these mental items, and that means that you can draw the inference that you have the mental item. Okay, so if you believe that it's raining outside, which it isn't, but if you believe it is, then you can infer from that that you have the belief that it's raining outside, right? So the rationally structured items in the mind are available for inference, and as a result, they're available to self-awareness. So they're conscious. Now, Sartre's criticism of this is that that's all very well, but how do we explain this attitude, this activity of repression and denial, and the related phenomenon of resistance, which supposedly is what happens when the psychoanalyst is getting close to the truth, and they start to hint toward the patient or ask them, well, do you think maybe you're suffering from the Oedipus complex, or whatever it is they ask. And because this complex is repressed and the patient won't admit it, they resist, and they refuse to believe what the analyst is saying. How is all that to be explained, according, Sartre asks, according to Freud's theory of the mind? What is it to be censoring features of your own mind so that you can't become aware of them, to make them dynamically unconscious, to keep them out of the conscious mind? What kind of activity is that? That censorship. It can't be itself an irrational activity, just another drive or desire that obeys the pleasure principle. Why not? Because it wouldn't work. In order to successfully censor desires that are socially disapproved of, you need to know what society disapproves of, and you need to know the content of the desires that are trying to become expressed in your behavior, and you need to be able to compare the two, and you need to be able to work out whether or not you can successfully repress a particular desire, and so on. And those are all rational processes. They all involve inference, they all involve the reality principle, they involve understanding the social reality that surrounds you, and also understanding the reality of the drives, what the drives are. Okay, so it looks like repression itself, censorship, whatever you want to call it, is itself a rational process. But in that case, it should be conscious. And if it was conscious, it wouldn't work, right? If you just knew that you were censoring your Oedipus complex, then you wouldn't succeed in censoring your Oedipus complex, because you'd know you had it, because you'd know you were censoring it. Okay, that's the essence of Sartre's criticism of Freud, that Freud's metapsychology fails to explain what it's supposed to explain, because there's no resources in that metapsychology, in that theory of mind, to explain how repression and resistance and denial and censorship and all these crucial Freudian things can happen. Right. So that's why Freud fails, according to Sartre. And I think Beauvoir goes along with this. Beauvoir doesn't develop this argument specifically herself, but she does refer to Sartre's discussion of Freud. So what's the existentialist alternative? Well, the existentialist alternative is to say that we're not going to talk about the conscious and the unconscious, or the rational and the irrational, or the reality principle and the pleasure principle, or any of that. We're not even going to try and translate that language into a new. We're just going to get rid of it and give a new account of the mind. Right? And that's the account and of motivation and behavior in particular. And that's the account that they build on the idea of a project. And so that's the account that is the basis of existentialism, which is what I've been talking about in all of these films. The idea that existence precedes essence, the idea that what drives a person's behavior is ultimately the projects that they have chosen to pursue, the values that they have endorsed and that they continue to endorse, and that they can, in some sense, abandon. Though Sartre and Beauvoir disagree on what that sense is. I'll come to that in a minute. So that's the existentialist alternative. That is compatible with the idea that you might be unaware of the root causes of some problematic behavior or some problematic desires that you have. Right, so that's the basic idea of psychoanalysis. You might be distressed by some of your behavior or some of your desires and not know what to do about it or where they're coming from, and need the help of an analyst to uncover that. On Sartre's view, that is to be explained by the very fact that projects structure your experience. So, as I've already explained in these films, Sartre's view is not just that you have projects and you have values, but that the way you experience things that you experience, the way you experience the world and the way you experience yourself, is filtered through the lens of those projects. And that's why you experience the world as having the particular structure of reasons that you experience it as having, right? That it prohibits certain things and invites other things as a result of the behavior, of the values that you have. And because that's true of your experience generally, it's not just true of your experience of the world around you, of alarm clocks and signs that tell you to keep off the grass, it's also true of your awareness of yourself. And so your own projects can occlude features of your own projects. Because when you come to reflect on yourself and think about your own values and think about your own projects, you're doing that through the lens of your own values and projects. So a good example of this is Sartre's explanation of the inferiority complex. The inferiority complex is something that Freud talks about, and Sartre takes it on and says, look, I can explain that too with my theory of mind. What's going on is this. The person suffering the inferiority complex has chosen the project of inferiority. It's their project to try and prove that they are inferior to other people, that there's something about them which means that they can't achieve the things that other people can achieve. And they prove this by setting about goals that are just unachievable for them, or trying to achieve them in ways which you could not achieve them, right? So deciding one day that you want to be a concert pianist, even though you've never played the piano before, right? It's just an unrealistic goal, not because you personally are in some way naturally inferior. It's just that that's not how you become a concert pianist. And so Sartre thinks not only that's what the inferiority project is, but as a result of having that project, if you then reflect on your own motivations, that project itself is going to hide your genuine motivation, right? You're not going to succeed in proving to yourself that you're naturally inferior if you at the same time you could admit that that's what you're trying to prove. So when you reflect on your own values and your own projects, the inferiority project itself is going to filter that information and make it look as though you are genuinely trying to achieve things that other people could genuinely achieve, and that if you fail, it's genuinely because there's something wrong with you. Okay, so that's Sartre's idea of psychoanalysis in a nutshell. All it can do is uncover the projects that you are pursuing, but which you've lost sight of as a result of your reflection being filtered or structured or shaped by your own projects. Right? Okay, so I'll say that again. Because your reflection on your own motivations is itself through the lens of your projects, that can mean that there are features of your own projects that you can't notice, you can't see through your own reflection, through reflecting on them yourself. Because your outlook is shaped by your projects. And it takes a psychoanalyst, or indeed just somebody else with a different set of projects and a different lens, seeing your motivation through a different lens, seeing your behavior through a different lens, to be able to uncover what the problematic projects are. Simone de Beauvoir, on the other hand, although I think she may agree with all of that, she's got further resources to explain why people can end up with behaviour or desires that they find distressing. Because Simone de Beauvoir, as I said in the previous film, believes in sedimentation. As far as she's concerned, projects become weightier, they become more deeply embedded, more influential over somebody's outlook the longer they are pursued and the more they are pursued. And that's not just true of the values at the heart of those projects, but it's also true of any kind of social meanings that get incorporated into those projects. And that's Beauvoir's theory of gender, right? So because you want, as you grow up as a child, you want to be praised and thanked, and you don't want to be told off. You do the things for which you get praised, and that trains you to kind of have the values, to value those things, and to pursue those things as your values. And as you grow up, these values become quite sedimented and quite embedded in your outlook, and they shape your outlook. And it may be later in life you reject all of that, and you reject that conditioning. But even if you do, it's kind of too late. You've already been conditioned. So although you no longer believe in the things that the values you were trained to have instilled in your outlook, they are still there, and they are still shaping your desires, and they're still shaping your attitudes in ways that you might not notice, in ways that you might not even realize. So, on Beauvoir's view, one aim of psychoanalysis is to diagnose the root causes of distress, not just in people's projects that are hidden from them by the fact that they only see themselves through the lens of their own projects, but also through the conflict that can arise between the values that we do endorse, the projects that we do want to pursue on the one hand, and on the other hand, the values that have been embedded in us by our social conditioning. Right? There can be a conflict between those two things, and it can be a conflict which isn't obvious to us that that's what the problem is. It can be that we find ourselves doing things that we don't agree with. We find ourselves wanting things that we actually, on reflection, reject, and that can be distressing. And the cause of it, as I say, is the conflict between the values that have become deeply embedded and then the more recently adopted values, the ones that you reflectively endorse, that you think are the right values, but which you haven't been pursuing long enough for them to have become your deeply embedded values and to displace the other ones. Okay, so that, briefly, is how Sartre and Beauvoir end up with different forms of psychoanalysis, which I think they both think of as standing in the Freudian tradition, different forms of existential psychoanalysis or existentialist psychoanalysis due to their differing understandings of the ways in which projects shape our experience, their differing conceptions of what it means to say existence precedes essence.